3 months before the HOA's attorney stopped returning my emails, before a construction project worth hundreds of thousands of dollars quietly disappeared from the community budget, and before my neighbors started asking me how I pulled it off, I was standing in my kitchen, holding a notice that basically told me part of my backyard no longer belonged to me. The funny thing is, nobody actually said those exact words. They didn't have to. Sometimes people reveal exactly what they're thinking by what they assume you'll never question. My name is Ethan Walker, and at the time, I had lived in Brookstone Ridge for almost 8 years. It wasn't some luxury development with private lakes and golf carts everywhere. It was the kind of suburban neighborhood where people waved when they drove by, where dogs knew each other's routes better than their owners did, and where the HOA mostly concerned itself with mailbox colors and whether somebody's trash can stay visible too long after pickup day. Honestly, I barely thought about the HOA most of the time. I paid my dues, kept my lawn cut, attended maybe one meeting every couple of years when guilt got the better of me, and otherwise stayed out of the drama. Looking back, maybe that was my first mistake. The whole thing started because of a conversation with my next-door neighbor, a retired electrician named Warren Pierce. Warren was one of those guys who somehow knew everything happening within a 2-mile radius before anyone else did. He wasn't nosy exactly, more like professionally curious. One Saturday morning, he wandered over while I was trimming hedges. "You got plans for that backstrip?" he asked. I remember stopping and looking at him. "What backstrip?" He pointed toward the rear corner of my property. "The little piece behind your fence line. Saw Sandra Coleman back there yesterday with some contractor-looking guy. They were measuring stuff." At the time, I shrugged. Sandra Coleman was the HOA president. She'd held the position for years and seemed to enjoy it a little too much. Not in an evil way necessarily, but she had this habit of speaking like every idea she had already become policy. If Sandra suggested something, she talked about it as though everyone else had already agreed. "Probably landscaping," I told him. Warren raised an eyebrow. "Maybe." Then he walked away, and honestly, I forgot about it. For about 48 hours. 2 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a neatly printed notice from the HOA. Community Connectivity Enhancement Project, Phase 2. Even the title sounded expensive. I stood there in my driveway reading through the details. New walking paths, improved pedestrian access, expanded green space, better community integration, the usual buzzwords. Then I unfolded the attached map. That's when my stomach tightened. A dotted line representing the future pathway cut directly through the rear section of my property. Not near it, not beside it, through it. I stared at the page for a long moment, thinking maybe I was reading it wrong. Maybe the map wasn't accurate. Maybe the scale was off. But deep down, I already knew exactly what I was looking at. You see, my lot had always been a little unusual. Most properties in Brookstone Ridge were simple rectangles. Mine looked more like an upside-down L. The strange section was a narrow strip extending behind the main fence line, roughly 8 feet wide and maybe 30 feet long. It bordered a large common lawn area, and because there wasn't a separate fence marking it, most people assumed it belonged to the neighborhood. I understood why. If you just glanced at it, it looked like shared land. But assumptions aren't deeds. Assumptions aren't surveys. Assumptions aren't county records. I went straight inside and dug through the filing cabinet in my home office. It took maybe 15 minutes to find my closing documents from when I bought the house. Then another hour to locate the original property description. By dinner time, I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. The narrow strip was listed right there. Every inch of it. I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office and ordered a certified copy of the recorded plat map. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I wanted confirmation from a source. When the clerk handed me the documents, I spread them out on a table and checked every measurement twice. Then 3 times. The result never changed. The land belonged to me. Legally. Completely. Unequivocally. And that's when my concern shifted into something else. Because if the paperwork was this clear, then why was the HOA planning a pathway through it? Were they mistaken? Had nobody checked the records? Or had somebody checked and simply decided it didn't matter? 2 days later, I got part of my answer. Around 6 in the evening, there was a knock on my front door. I opened it and found Sandra standing there with the same polished smile she wore at every HOA meeting. The kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Ethan," she said cheerfully, "just wanted to touch base regarding the Pathway project." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "Sure." She nodded toward the backyard. "That area has been used by the community for years. People walk through there all the time. Kids play there. Nobody's ever really treated it as private property." I noticed she never actually asked whether it was private property. She skipped that part entirely. "Interesting," I said. Her smile widened. "We're simply formalizing what already exists, making improvements, adding value to the neighborhood." Then she looked directly at me and said something I'll never forget. "I'm sure you understand. Now do you agree? Now what do you think? Now can we discuss it? You understand." Like the decision had already been made and my role was simply to accept it. I remember standing there feeling strangely calm. The calmer she sounded, the more suspicious I became. "I'll look into it," I replied. For the first time, her smile flickered, just slightly. Then it came back. "Of course." She left a minute later. I watched her walk down the driveway, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation wasn't really a conversation at all. It was a test, and I just failed to give the answer she expected. What Sandra didn't know was that I had already seen the documents, and the moment she drove away, I made a decision that would eventually stop the entire project in its tracks. The next morning, instead of calling the HOA, arguing with neighbors, or posting a frustrated rant online like half the people I know probably would have done, I called a survey company. One thing my father taught me years ago was that when a dispute starts involving property, contracts, or money, opinions become worthless pretty fast. Documents matter. Measurements matter. Facts matter. Everything else is just noise. The surveyor who came out was a guy named Randall Hayes, maybe in his late 50s with sunburned arms and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from spending 30 years settling arguments without ever raising his voice. He walked the property with me for nearly an hour, carrying old maps and electronic equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything I expected. At one point, he stopped near the rear corner of the lot and looked at the paperwork I'd given him. Then he looked at the land, then back at the paperwork. "Well," he said, "somebody's definitely going to be disappointed." I laughed. "Hopefully not me." He smiled. "Not you." That was the first time I felt genuine relief. 3 days later, Randall's crew returned and began placing markers throughout the property. Bright orange flags appeared at every critical point. Steel pins were located, verified, and documented. The property line wasn't even close to where the HOA's pathway proposal suggested it should be. The strip belonged entirely to my lot. Not partially, not conditionally, entirely. Apparently, I wasn't the only one paying attention. By lunchtime, neighbors had started slowing down as they walked past. A few stopped to ask questions. Others simply watched from a distance. That evening, Warren showed up carrying 2 coffees. "Well," he asked. I pointed toward the survey flags. "It's mine." He grinned. I figured. Then his expression changed. "Sandra's not going to like that. That's not really my problem." "No," he said, taking a sip, "but she's probably going to make it hers." Looking back, that was probably the most accurate prediction anyone made during the entire situation. A few days later, I submitted an application for a fence permit through the city. Nothing fancy, just a standard 6-foot cedar privacy fence positioned exactly on the legal boundary. Every measurement matched the survey. Every form was completed properly. Every requirement was satisfied. For business days later, the permit was approved. I remember staring at the approval email and laughing to myself. It felt almost anticlimactic. No heatings, no disputes, no obstacles, just approval, which made sense because from the city's perspective, a homeowner wanted to build a fence on his own property. There wasn't much to discuss. What I didn't know at the time was that word had already reached the HOA board. Apparently, Sandra attended an executive committee meeting that same week and informed everyone that I was attempting to obstruct a community improvement project. The phrase community improvement project will become one of my favorites because it sounded so noble and reasonable until you translated it into plain English. What it actually meant was, we want something that belongs to somebody else. The fence crew arrived on a Tuesday morning. Around 8 o'clock, 2 trucks pulled into the driveway and 6 workers stepped out. They unloaded posts, concrete, tools, and stacks of cedar panels. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, mild temperature, just enough breeze to keep everyone comfortable. As work began, I noticed movement across the common lawn. Sandra, she was standing about 50 yards away with another board member. Neither of them approached. They simply watched. Every now and then they pointed toward the workers. I almost walked over to say hello, but decided against it. There wasn't really anything left to discuss. By noon, the first section of fence was already standing. By 3 o'clock, the pathway route shown on the HOA's proposal map had effectively disappeared behind solid cedar boards. And by the time the crew packed up their tools that afternoon, the entire strip was enclosed. I walked the perimeter myself before sunset. Every post sat inside the surveyed boundary. Every measurement matched the permit. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was done. For the first time in weeks, I slept well. That peace lasted exactly 6 days. The certified letter arrived the following Monday. The HOA demanded immediate removal of the fence. According to the letter, the structure interfered with long-standing community access, negatively impacted neighborhood planning objectives, and created an unreasonable barrier to common use areas. I read the entire thing twice. Then I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Not because it was funny exactly, but because the wording revealed their real problem. Notice what wasn't included. They never claimed the land belonged to them. They never disputed ownership. They never challenged the survey. They couldn't. Instead, they focused on inconvenience. Apparently, the fact that people wanted access to my property was now an argument for taking it. That afternoon, I responded. My email contained exactly 3 attachments: the certified plat map, the survey report, the approved fence permit. No explanations, no insults, no emotional speeches. Just 3 documents. I hit send and went back to work. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one came from an attorney representing the HOA. Now I'll admit, seeing legal letterhead gets your attention. Even when you know you're right, it still creates that little knot in your stomach. Maybe you felt it before. Rationally, you know the facts support you. Emotionally, your brain starts inventing worst-case scenarios anyway. I spent that evening sitting on my back patio looking at the fence and wondering how far this would go. Lawsuit? Mediation? Court hearings? Thousands of dollars in legal fees? My mind explored every possibility. Then something happened that changed the entire situation. I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney of my own named Rebecca Dalton. Rebecca listened patiently while I explained everything. She reviewed the documents, flipped through the survey, examined the deed, and occasionally nodded to herself. After about 20 minutes, she leaned back in her chair. "You're worried about the wrong thing," she said. "What do you mean?" "You're worried they hired a lawyer." "Shouldn't I be?" She smiled. "No, they should be." I remember blinking. "Why?" She tapped the survey report. "Because lawyers don't work from assumptions. Lawyers work from records. The moment their attorney pulls the county file, this argument becomes very difficult for them." That conversation changed my entire perspective. Until then, I'd been viewing the attorney as a threat. Rebecca saw him as an auditor, someone whose job was to verify reality. If reality happened to support me, his involvement could actually help. And as it turned out, she was exactly right. About a week later, something strange happened. Nothing. No follow-up letter. No demand for mediation. No notice of litigation. No request for negotiation. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into a month. Complete silence. At first, I assumed they were preparing some larger strategy behind the scenes. Then Warren shared a piece of information that explained everything. One evening, he wandered over carrying his usual coffee and neighborhood gossip. "You hear what happened?" he asked. "No. Friend of mine knows somebody on the architectural committee." I laughed. "That's a very small-town sentence. Just listen." He lowered his voice dramatically. Apparently, the HOA lawyer pulled the county records, reviewed everything, and then asked the board a very uncomfortable question. Which was? Warren grinned. Did any of you actually check ownership before spending money designing this project? I couldn't help laughing. Ouch. Gets better. Oh, nobody had. I stared at him. You're kidding. Nope. According to Warren, the room got very quiet after that. The board had already paid consultants. They'd already developed pathway plans. They'd already discussed construction timelines. Some members had even publicly promoted the project. Yet apparently nobody had bothered to verify who owned the land they intended to build on. They simply assumed. And assumptions can become very expensive mistakes. That should have been the end of the story. Honestly, I expected it to be. But a few weeks later, I discovered something that made the entire situation far more interesting than a simple property dispute, because it turned out the pathway itself was never really the reason Sandra wanted that land in the first place. A few weeks after the silence began, life had mostly returned to normal. The fence stood exactly where it had been built. The HOA wasn't sending letters anymore, and for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about property lines every day. Then one Saturday morning, I ran into a guy named Leonard Brooks at a local hardware store. Leonard had served on the HOA board years earlier before moving to another neighborhood nearby. We weren't close friends, but we knew each other well enough to stop and talk. Somewhere in the conversation, he mentioned hearing about my dispute with Sandra. I laughed and told him the situation seemed finished. He gave me a look I'll never forget. "You really think the pathway was the point?" he asked. That question stuck with me. "What do you mean?" Leonard hesitated for a second before answering. Sandra's been trying to connect that common lawn to the west side of the neighborhood for years. The pathway was only one piece of it. I listened while he explained. Apparently, several board members believed connecting those areas would increase the appearance of open space throughout the development. Not actual open space, just the appearance of it. Future buyers would see long, uninterrupted walking corridors and larger recreational zones. Better marketing, better property values, better optics. The problem was that my strip of land sat directly in the middle of the route they wanted. In other words, my property wasn't valuable because it was useful to me. It was valuable because it was inconvenient to them. Driving home that afternoon, I kept thinking about that idea. It explained a lot. It explained Sandra's confidence when she knocked on my door. It explained why nobody bothered checking ownership records. It explained why the project had moved so far forward before anyone verified basic facts. They weren't treating the land as property. They were treating it as an obstacle. And obstacles are easy to ignore when you're convinced your vision is more important than somebody else's rights. A month later, I finally saw Sandra again. We crossed paths at a neighborhood meeting held in the clubhouse. It was the first time we'd been in the same room since the attorney got involved. The meeting itself had nothing to do with the pathway project. Ironically, it was about landscaping budgets. But everyone knew there was another story sitting quietly beneath the surface. At some point during a break, Sandra approached me near the coffee table. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she smiled politely. "Looks like things worked out for you." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't admission. It was the closest thing she was willing to offer. I nodded. "Looks like they worked out according to the county records." Her smile tightened slightly. "Just enough. The project would have benefited a lot of people." Maybe. Sometimes communities need compromise. I remember looking at her for a second before answering. Compromise usually involves asking. That landed exactly the way I intended it to. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just true. She didn't respond right away. Then she nodded once and walked away. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. Over the following months, pieces of information continued filtering through the neighborhood. The pathway project was quietly removed from future planning discussions. Several homeowners started asking more questions about proposed HOA expenditures. Attendance at board meetings increased. People became more interested in reviewing documents before approving ideas. Funny how that happens. One expensive mistake can suddenly make everyone curious about accountability. The strangest part was that many neighbors who initially disagreed with me eventually changed their minds. Early on, some people thought I was being stubborn. A few believed I should have simply donated the land for the good of the community. One resident actually told me, "It's only a small strip. Why make such a big deal out of it?" That's an easy argument when it's somebody else's property. Nobody ever volunteers their own land first. But after the facts became public, perspective shifted. People realized the issue wasn't the size of the property. It was the principle behind it. If ownership can be ignored whenever a project sounds beneficial, then ownership doesn't really mean much at all. Today, the fence is still there. The cedar has weathered a little. The boards aren't as bright as they were on installation day. But every time I walk past it, I remember something important. Most conflicts don't start with villains twirling mustaches and announcing evil plans. They start with assumptions. Somebody assumes they know better. Somebody assumes the rules won't matter. Somebody assumes another person won't push back. And sometimes those assumptions grow into expensive mistakes. Looking back, I don't think Sandra ever saw herself as the bad guy. Honestly, I think she genuinely believed she was improving the neighborhood. That's what makes situations like this complicated. Good intentions don't automatically justify bad decisions. Wanting something badly doesn't make it yours. Believing a project benefits everyone doesn't give you the right to ignore the one person carrying the cost. If there's one lesson I took from the entire experience, it's this. The loudest person in a dispute isn't usually the strongest one. The strongest person is often the one holding the paperwork. While everyone else is arguing, they're verifying facts. While everyone else is making assumptions, they're checking records. And when reality finally catches up with the conversation, facts tend to win. Most of the time, anyway. But here's the question I've never been able to answer, and maybe that's where you come in. If you had been in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have protected every inch of property you legally owned, even if it disappointed the neighborhood? Or would you have given up the land for the sake of community harmony and avoided the entire fight? I still hear both sides whenever this story comes up. Some people tell me I defended an important principle. Others say I cared too much about a narrow strip of dirt. Maybe they're both right. Maybe that's why this story still sparks debates years later. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Was I justified for building the fence and stopping the project? Or should I have found a way to compromise? And if you've ever had an HOA, neighbor, or local board try to claim something that didn't belong to them, share your story too. I read every comment, and trust me, after what happened in Brookfield Ridge, very little surprises me anymore.